and I'll kick off with my first point, which, if you can read that, capitalism kills. And I say that because it's not just the COVID that's killing us. Today, the death toll, the official death toll, is over 21,000. We already know as well that there's over 3 million now forced to food banks by this crisis already. But we know as well that both of those figures, as people were saying before the meeting started, are massive underestimates, because we know that the Tories lie as they speak. And I think we have to be absolutely clear that austerity, privatisation and cuts have massively contributed to making that death toll and that suffering toll much higher than it would otherwise have been. And I'm not going to give loads of facts and figures because people know them, but I think we have to say clearly that both the Tories and the Blairite New Labour governments left the NHS criminally unprepared for this crisis. Cuts and privatisation, loss of beds, meaning we've got one of the lowest levels of ICU care and so on. But privatisation has also been a major factor, especially in the brutal situation that we're seeing developing in care homes. I checked the figures. So in 1993, 95% of care homes were council run, and today 84% of them are run for profit. And it's an absolute tragedy that we're seeing taking place. And we're asked to sit on our sofas and watch the news and hear what's going on there, where no measures are being taken. And we know these figures now. It's been revealed. We were suspicious, but now it's been confirmed by some of the revelations, hasn't it? That even though the risk of the pandemic was known about, has been in fact prepared for, the Tories cut the PPE stockpile and the preparations as part of its austerity drive that has also driven down our living standards. And linked to that, low pay and high rents have led to overcrowding, have led to overwork, and both of those conditions increase our vulnerability to the virus. And on a world scale, we can see that globalization and deindustrialization have left most of the advanced capitalist world short of medicine and protective equipment manufacturing. And going further into what we're likely to see develop, half the planet lacks sanitation and health services. In Africa especially, where weakened by capitalism, including colossal debt repayments tied very often to privatisation there as well. So we've made it clear, the Socialist Party, over the last decades, that austerity, cuts and privatisation have been key tools for pro-capitalist governments to transfer wealth to big business from the working class. And we, just one figure, I think, gives evidence of that. During the decade of austerity, the shareholders in Britain's 100 biggest companies in the FTSE 100, they doubled their annual take for shareholders to £110 billion. And I think we have to draw the conclusion that capitalism has rolled out the red carpet for COVID to spread, hitting the working class and the poor the hardest. So the next point I want to deal with, and it's just able to be headlines really, because there's so much to get through, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has got to say. But the next point is that capitalism is a barrier to action. And people might think, well, there's been a lot of, bloody huge amount of action. And that's true. The Tories initially weren't planning to do any action, were they? Their initial approach was the do nothing herd immunity strategy. And internationally, we saw that the likes of Trump claiming it was a Democratic Party hoax, although that was not the worst thing that he's come to say, as we were just commenting on before the meeting. But it's not really a joke, is it? It's extremely serious that they were not acting in the interests of society's health and safety. But then the research showed, as we know, that in Britain, it could lead to 40 million infections, around 250,000 deaths, and the NHS being overwhelmed. And we then saw an incredible U-turn by the capitalist leaders, who then carried out state interventions on a gigantic scale that none of us could have imagined. Trump's package was the $2 trillion, the biggest in history. anti-working class, pro-capitalist governments around the world suddenly flung their previous policies out the window and, for example, were setting prices or taking the powers to set prices, to requisition goods and factories, wartime laws, being enacted and so on. And that was impossible to imagine even weeks beforehand. And in reality, the Tories here in Britain have been forced to go even further than Jeremy Corbyn was putting forward and have, done things like nationalisation that they ridiculed him for, nationalisation of the railways. But we have to be clear, this is not socialism. These measures have been taken to prop up the capitalist system. What they're doing when they're taking on industries and companies is to still run them from the top in the interests of big business. They're not going further than just nationalising those parts of the economy that are struggling in order to give them back to big business afterwards. We've seen that before, haven't we? So take, for example, something that would be very useful to see nationalisation in, because there's an urgent search for a vaccine and that would really benefit. It's clear, isn't it? Doctors are saying it, scientists are saying it, they're frustrated that there isn't more cooperation and sharing of research. But the obstacle to that is that the company that comes out with a vaccine first is going to make, on the basis of capitalism and the market system, unimaginable profits. And so that's an absolute barrier to the kind of effective action that we need to protect society's health and safety. What we're seeing, so we call for the nationalisation of the pharmaceutical industry under working class democratic control and management. But the Tories, we can see, are only nationalising to prop up companies or industries that won't survive otherwise and to save their system. So the next point I wanted to deal with is that capitalism is herd immunity. And we always explain as socialists that capitalism is incapable of meeting all our needs and protecting the environment, and the reason being it prioritises profit. But this crisis has done more to expose that than any amount of Socialist Party leaflets or newspapers or Zoom meetings or in-person meetings could have done. The Tory party exists to defend capitalism, and that's what it was trying to do when it came up with this herd immunity approach. And that response has always been the approach of British capitalism when it comes to public health. It wasn't the Tories or the capitalist class that came up with the idea of the NHS. They opposed it. It was fought for by the working class, emboldened after the Second World War. And despite all the claims that we're seeing now of scientific advice and so on, we can see that they have picked and chosen and allowed Cummings to taint the scientific advice as well. And we've been looking a little bit at the 1918 flu pandemic, which killed 228,000 people in Britain. But it's shocking, it was never discussed. A crisis of that scale was never discussed by the British cabinet. And at the time, they issued advice, things like avoid public transport, self-isolate the sick, but no serious measures were taken. Mass gatherings continued and factories to produce profit for the capitalist class operated freely. And that's because the capitalist class, the priority is always not the health of the population, but the health of their system. And we're taking no action to counter disease has no negative economic or political consequences, i.e. it's not going to bring the production to a standstill or whatever. No action is taken. And I think we can see that we don't have to look to 1918, we can look to what's happening right now, because across the world, the fact that malaria still kills an average of half a million people a year worldwide proves this. It's estimated that it would cost £90 billion to eradicate malaria globally by 2040. So that's less than the annual take of those FTSE 100 shareholders. But it remains a rampant killer in the neo-colonial world, and that's the capitalist approach to public health. So the next point I wanted to come on to is capitalism is a class system. So if you just looked at the headlines and just looked at the Tory briefings, you wouldn't really think that, would you? Because what we're told all the time is we're all in it together. and the Tories are desperate to convince us of that. And where previously they were clapping in Parliament as they cut nurses' pay, now they're clapping alongside the rest of us, the NHS heroes. But we have to be clear, a leopard doesn't change its spots. And the reality, of course, tells us a different story. Our experience is completely different. We've seen that there's tests for Tories, but not for nurses. And we know that globally, tens of millions of workers have been forced out of their jobs. And that's because capitalism is a system that is based on exploitation of the working class majority by the capitalist class, which is a tiny minority. But that gives the working class enormous power. The working class, we produce the wealth, the profits, we make society work. And actually, we've had, the last couple of decades, the likes of Tony Blair telling us there's no such thing as class anymore and so on. But the role of the working class and the role of class, the divide, has really been revealed in this crisis. And it's fantastic, really, isn't it? Those who were undervalued and low paid, still low paid, in capitalism are revealed suddenly as key workers, as heroes. The workers in care homes and supermarkets and bin trucks, delivering parcels, etc. But also, when we talk about the potential power, look at the potential power, for example, of teachers that's been revealed. Because in the service of big business, the Tories are really desperate. I mean, they can't agree on exactly how to exit the lockdown, can they? But they are desperate to get us back to work, back to buying capacity and producing capacity. And part of that is a desperation to get the schools back, because if schools aren't open, parents can't work. But that has a huge impact on capitalist profits. So the teachers, if they were to, you can see the potential for teachers' strike action to really strike at capitalist profit and the power that goes with that. And going into this crisis, though, unfortunately, we had quite a low level of working class organisation in the trade unions. And that largely flows from the failure of trade unions to give a fighting lead over the last decade of austerity. It wasn't clear to your average young Tesco warehouse worker or your average young Deliveroo driver or whatever why you would join a union when they weren't giving a fighting lead. And we have to say, because it's not our job to cheerlead or anything like that, we have to say what is, that it's an enormous mistake by the trade union leaders now today to accept that in this crisis, some sort of national interest or need for national unity prevents trade unions from organising action in defence of members who are in work now or when they go back to work. There is no national unity. There are just different class interests in a class society, the exploiter and the exploited, and they are diametrically opposed. And so part of our work at the moment, and as is always the case, is to campaign for fighting trade unions to act in the interests of the working class, to fight through the trade union members that we've got, to organise, to raise ideas in the unions, to recruit and build the unions. And actually the potential for that is shown by the thousands who've been joining up to the unions over the last few weeks. Now, my next point is capitalism is crisis. So some of the stories that we've had in the press recently have focused on some of the really rotten, horrible examples that there are. The Bezoses, making extra billions in profit and sacking workers fighting for workplace safety. The Tesco's taking the $500 million or whatever for furloughed workers while paying out more than that to their shareholders. The Richard Bransons and so on. But capitalism's rottenness doesn't just come from a few bad apples like that. If that were the case, it would probably be a bit easier to change it. As Karl Marx explained, the class nature of capitalism, and he explained how it's full of contradictions, make it riven with crisis. And actually, the crises of capitalism, we're not yet recovered from the one that took place 10 years ago in 2007, 2008. And the capitalist class itself has learnt none of the lessons that came out of that crisis. I mean, we had enormous, like today, but not on such a huge scale, amounts of money pumped into the economy. But again, it all went into the pockets of big business. None of it went into the hands of the workers to raise living standards, of their ability to buy and so on. The bosses, though, then did not invest. They sat on it, a real indication of the sickness of the capitalist system. And there was no recovery from that crisis, and especially not for working class people. So things absolutely were not going well with the onset of the corona crisis, very far from it. World economic growth was already slowing, and it was clear that a recession was on its way. But the speed of economic, the speed of the decline of economic activity with the shutdown and with the fear taking grip that we're seeing is absolutely unprecedented. And what's also unprecedented is that it's taking place across the world almost simultaneously. One commentator described it as whole swathes of the economy going into cardiac arrest. And just in terms of like how sick the system was when this virus attacked it, there isn't time to go into the detail about oil prices, unemployment and underemployment and productivity and so on. But one figure I think really is quite shocking, that global debt is an unprecedented mountain. It's the equivalent of $86,000 for each person on the planet, and corporate debt is at a record $13.5 trillion. And just to add to that situation, unlike 2007, when the capitalist classes across the world came together to try and act to put a floor under the crisis to save their system, today there's much deeper tensions between them to make that kind of coordinated action very difficult. But one thing is universal, really, that across the world, the ruling classes fear the reaction that's going to come from below in response to their handling and largely mishandling of the crisis. So much the case that Johnson felt the need to say that, unlike in 2007, 2008, this time it wasn't going to be the case that the money went to the bankers and the rich, but to struggling workers and small businesses. But actually, we know, and we have to prepare the working class as much as we can, that at some point they are going to turn back to trying to balance the books, and that will be at the expense of ordinary people. But I think we can be confident that in this case they're going to meet even more fierce resistance than that followed the previous crisis. So I think we can see major class battles coming. So we've got to try and help prepare for that. And one of the things that way that we did that is by preparing a programme of what we fight for. So our headline demands are PPE for all NHS and frontline staff, tests and pay, full pay for all, not a 20% pay cut, but full pay for all. Take over the private health and necessary facilities and industries to meet the crisis, not a penny to the profiteers, so compensation only on the basis of proven need, not to the fat cats, and socialist planning, not capitalist chaos. And I'm not going to go through the entirety of our charter that we've produced, a workers' charter for the coronavirus, which is updated each week and on the back of our paper, but just to give a taste of the points that we've raised. Things like, we've got to look at every way that workers can see how action can be taken in their interest. So we've raised things like that councils, who are always, there's nothing we can do like that in the face of Tory austerity, that they use their powers to take over empty homes to house the homeless, some of which has been done but not adequately, but also those in inadequate housing and those fleeing domestic violence, which is obviously on the rise horrendously. And the hotels should be used to provide emergency accommodation. And we also call on the councils to scrap their existing cuts budgets and to demand that the government nationally finance all additional spending to deal with the coronavirus crisis, as well as releasing the resources to reverse a decade of austerity. And in our programme, we need to deal with the immediate crisis, which is some of those things, but also demands for the situation going forward, but also to try and point to the role of the working class in fighting for rights and for safety, and linked to that the need to fight for workers' control and the socialist transformation of society. And we've also support the programme, the charter that's been produced by socialist students, because students and young people absolutely must not pay a COVID penalty, but that means organising young people to fight for their future, for a free education, because the universities and schools are potentially going to be in enormous crisis, for the right to training, the right to a job, and also council homes and so on. So I just mentioned the next issue I want to come on to, which is workers' control. And it's absolutely clear, isn't it? They keep kind of disagreeing amongst themselves because they don't want to move too fast. But it's absolutely clear that the Tories and their friends in big business are trying to build momentum to push for more what they call non-essential workers to go back to work. But we have no confidence whatsoever from everything that we've seen in this crisis and before, that the bosses and their political representatives in the Tories and the Blairites can be trusted with our safety. Profit is their number one priority, always. I mean, look at the construction companies. Today it's International Workers' Memorial Day, a really important day in the calendar of the labour movement, not just this year but every year, because of the way that the bosses cut corners with our safety to prioritise profit. But one of the demands has been shut the sites. And look at the construction companies forcing workers back onto the sites. We had Alok Sharma, the business secretary, the other week saying, you know, social distancing should take place where possible. Well, that's not good enough, because that puts lives at risks. And absolutely, we would say that building luxury apartments is not essential work. Who's going to decide when it's safe to go back to work? We have to say that has to be down to the workers, and to act on that, we need workers' organisation. We need workers and trade union control over workplace safety. If a workplace isn't safe, if it's not possible to socially distance, or there isn't correct PPE, it must be closed and workers sent home on full pay until it's made safe. If management tell workers that they want us to come back to work, I think we have to raise the idea that we must only return when the workers and the unions are convinced that it's safe to do so. And that means things like, because in our charter we raised the idea of full workplace safety committees of trade unionists, joint unions where necessary, but also that the trade unions must have full oversight over all the measures taken by the Tories and private and big business during this crisis. And that we're developing that programme as we go, as the situation develops. So now on the buses, for example, where Sadiq Khan is saying that Transport for London is going to go into its reserves and run out of money if it doesn't open the front doors, which were endangering bus drivers' lives and sadly contributing to the deaths that have taken place. We're raising the idea through the bus driver Socialist Party members who are in discussion with thousands of other bus drivers in London, that things like union and workers' risk assessment must be carried out, that there must be adequate, and then a programme of demands, obviously PPE, hand sanitisers, washroom facilities, that might include the need for shorter shifts, shorter routes and so on, thorough workplace cleaning of the buses. The bus drivers had to actually fight for that as well. In other workplaces, the case for a workplace layout and staff capacity that allows for safe social distancing, regular testing, and any other measures considered necessary to guarantee workers' safety by the workforce itself. And that if management do not accept those demands, rather than take this idea that the union movement goes to sleep, that workers must discuss what to do next, including deciding collectively to refuse to work in unsafe conditions. Sorry, I just realised there was notes from Tom that I hadn't seen before. They don't come up on my thing. Okay, moving on quickly then. Workers' voice is needed. So obviously I've outlined how we stand for fighting trade unions, but workers also need a political voice. Otherwise, as has always been said, it means that we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. And that's really the origin of the Labour Party itself, that workers who were fighting against the bosses, fighting absolute poverty, pay and conditions, recognised that there was no one in Parliament who represented their interests, that they could fight and fight and fight in the communities and the workplaces, but their struggles were, you know, needed back up in Parliament. But under Sir Keir Starmer, that is not the role that the Labour Party is preparing to play. And it was incredible, wasn't it, that you've got the likes of the BBC on Panorama and Rupert Murdoch, and not the Labour Party, that have launched the kind of first major attacks of criticism on Johnson and the Tories. And it's interesting, isn't it? I think they are worried, those elements of the representatives of the capitalist class, voices of the capitalist class, are worried that the hatred of the Tories that's building up, they're falling rapidly in the polls, anger is growing, could lead to social unrest that's been widely predicted. And they see the Tories potentially being booted out of power and unable to defend capitalist interests. But they're confident to have that attack on the Tories because they've got the backup, a second 11, if you like, in the form of the Labour Party, an alternative voice for capitalism. And that's what the victory of Keir Starmer represents, and it does mean the end of the Corbyn era. Now, let's be absolutely clear, the Socialist Party welcomed wholeheartedly the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. It showed the huge anti-austerity anger that existed and the desire to fight. But we warned from the start that the Labour Party would be unable to become a voice for the working class while defenders of capitalism remained within it, especially where they dominated the Parliamentary Labour Party, the councillors, much of the structures, and that was, you know, further revealed in the and confirmed in the recent leak. But we didn't just warn, we put forward a programme to transform the Labour Party through deselection of the Blairites, restoring the central role of the trade unions, and opening the party up on a democratic federal basis to campaigners and to socialists to discuss and debate the production of a socialist programme that could, you know, represent the interests of working class people. So we say now is the time to draw a line in the sand about that the role of defenders of the capitalist class is becoming absolutely clear in this crisis, and an urgent discussion is needed in the labour and trade union movement about how to build a workers' party capable, you know, deserving of the name, able to represent working class interests. So I wanted to briefly deal with why we need socialism before I finish up on why we want you to join the Socialist Party if you're not already a member. And I think the measures that the governments have taken so far are going to do two things. One, they give us a glimpse of what's possible, don't they? They show us capitalism isn't capable of defending the health and safety of society, so it's got to reach into the toolbox of socialism and gives you a glimpse of what is possible. But the other side that it shows is that our lives aren't safe in their hands. And I think one of the former elements is that the idea of nationalisation is going to be more widely understood, what it could be. And like I said, we differentiate. We talk about nationalisation under democratic working class control and management. But we have to be prepared that when we put that forward, not outside of this crisis situation, that it's not normal for the capitalist class to go along with it in any way whatsoever, that normally they will scream and they will fight back. They want us to go back to normality, which for them means carrying on exploiting us. It means carrying on with austerity, poverty pay and falling living standards. And the thing is, you can't convince the capitalist class who own and control the major corporations and banks to be nice. They're not going to raise pay or pay a living wage or invest in the health, because in the end their profits come first. And their profits come from the exploitation of the working class. That's just the reality of the situation. But what this crisis is, what we're trying to say is what this crisis reveals is that we're not powerless. Some power resides in Parliament, but ultimately the bosses in big business have got power. You can see, can't we, how state institutions ultimately act in their interests. Every country has passed corona laws. In Dublin last week, we saw those laws being used by the police to remove a protest by shop workers, deboning workers. But there's an alternative power, and that's the working class, and it's enormous power potentially, because like I said, we're the ones who make the profit, who keep society running. And when we strike on big enough of a scale, society stops. And mass action can have enormous impact. We can win reforms in the interest of the working class when the threat to the capitalist class's right to rule is posed. But as long as they still exist and they still hold power, then they're going to come back and try and take everything they've had back. Some people will have had free education, but that was taken back under Blair, and there's many examples that we could give. So more fundamental measures are needed, not just nationalising bits of the economy, but taking over the commanding heights of the economy. And that's why we say to solve the problems faced by both people and the environment, it does require more than just removing the profit motive from some of the elements of the economy that Corbyn talked about, rail, mail, etc., etc. Well, much as we welcomed that, it means removing the grip of big business from society altogether. And it's not actually, when you think about it, so in Britain, those FTSE 100 companies that I talked about, they actually represent 81% of the entire market capitalisation of the London Stock Exchange. So nationalising the biggest companies in the banking system, that would give you the main levers of the economy, and that would provide the basis to begin democratically planning production and the use of resources properly without interference from that 1% or 0.1%. And workers could be involved in decisions about running society. And a little glimpse of that was given, I think, by, I don't know if people saw the story about the General Electric workers in the US. They were being sacked because the company basically decided that they could save up to $1 billion by mothballing the company. But they went out and protested. This was quite early on. And they said, no, our skills, our ability to work, all of this technology, all of the understanding that we have of how it's used and what it's capable of, that could be used for the urgent production of ventilators and other essential kit that's needed in this crisis. And similarly with the environment, we can see how drastic measures can really make a difference, but it's not possible while things are left in the hands of the capitalist class. So there's more I wanted to say about that, but I'm going to just move on to my final point, which is join the Socialist Party. So I think before this crisis, it was very clear to a lot of people that capitalism was incapable of offering a decent life to the majority of people, but that's much clearer now. And we'd say to anyone who recognises that, then your place is with us in the Socialist Party. And I want to give a few reasons why that is. For one, we're fighters, and that's what we need right now. And we've got a proven record. The Socialist Party, before my time, but I'm very proud of it, like all of our members, we led the mass non-payment campaign against Maggie Thatcher's poll tax, which brought down not just that tax, but Thatcher herself. And our tactic in that was based on our understanding of the power of collective working class action and our confidence in the working class to organise and fight. And today we're seeing some small versions of that. There's huge pressure, as I kind of alluded to accept that now is not the time to be political. Probably all of you have had that from family or friends or workmates or whatever. Like I said, also unfortunately from some of the trade union leaders, which is a mistake by them. And that has got to be resisted, as has the lie that we're all in it together. We live in a capitalist society and capitalist ideas dominate. And no one's immune to those ideas, but being in a party and being able to discuss everything that's going on, that gives us much more strength to stand up to the bosses and the Tories and those ideas. But like I said, there's small examples of our confidence in class action and collective action being shown all the time. I can see Dave is here in the meeting. He's got, very good reports to give us, but also, like I said, it's our members on the buses who've got the front doors closed. It's our members who've got construction sites closed down. It's our members in schools who've got reps elected, who've been able then to make demands on head teachers on social distancing and rotas and many more things. And in fact, this is a reason to read The Socialist, because it's got many of these reports which give you enormous confidence in socialist ideas and in the collective class, working class action to defend to defend us against the virus and against unsafe working conditions. So, you know, that's why we come to these meetings each week. We get ideas from each other. We're not a huge party, but we are able to have that impact because socialist ideas really arm us and make us stronger than we are for the day-to-day struggles, but they also prepare us for the future. And this is my last point, really, that it's not, as I've tried to show, it's not us that creates the opportunity to change society. Socialists we don't have that power, unfortunately, but we know that mass movements arise when people are unwilling to put up with the rotten system anymore, and that's, you know, something that there is big potential for now, as we saw in the Arab Spring and many times throughout history. But it's very difficult once those movements start, once there's a movement after this situation, to then build a party from scratch that is, you know, absorbed all of the lessons of the 1918 pandemic, the post-war period, the poll tax, all those different things, and much, much more, all the struggles of workers to recognise that it's necessary to break with capitalism, that's prepared to do that and prepared to go all the way in fighting for a new socialist order. And in that situation, a small party, we're quite confident, if its ideas are tested and found to be useful to the working class, can grow quite rapidly. And if there isn't any such party, there's a danger that that vacuum could be filled by existing parties who, in one way or another, defend the status quo and then can derail the movement by not fighting for socialist change. And the other thing, just to say briefly, is that we are also internationalists. We're not just organised in England and Wales, also Scotland and Ireland, but we're part of a socialist world organisation, the Committee for a Workers' International, because we understand that socialism has to be an international struggle. And now we're in this kind of unique situation where the entire world is experiencing the same crisis at the same time. The potential for socialism to spread rapidly is probably greater than ever before. So while we remain in a terrible situation with regards to the crisis, there are reasons for optimism for socialist struggle and the ability to change the world. So we hope that if you've not yet done it, that you join us in fighting for that. And sorry, my breaking up of the points, I think, made me go on for a bit too long, so I do apologise for that.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah.